right. So my name's Sam Selikoff, and this is my first React Conf, actually. It's been awesome so far. And my talk is called React Unpacked, a roadmap to React 19. But as you just saw, there's a ton of features in React 19. And since I only have 20 minutes, really, today to play, we are going to basically focus on actions. And also because I'm the last talk before lunch here, I figured it would be more fun to just do some live coding. So we're going to take a look basically at what Angie was talking about this morning and see how some of these new action APIs work. So this should be fun. Let's see here. OK. So is that big enough? Let's see, maybe one more. A little more space. OK, so this is the demo that we are looking at. Pretty simple app right here on the right. We have a little debug toolbar down here with kind of the server-side state. So we have a value for how much stock the t-shirt has. We have a description right here. And I can expand some details for the shirt. And if I go ahead and refresh, I reset the cart down to 0. I can click Add to Cart. We see some pending UI right here, and then we get a refresh. And I can refresh this down here. And if we make this down to 0 and I click Add to Cart, we get a refresh. And we see an error because we can't add anything else to the cart. So pretty simple UI. And right now, this is built all with client-side, typical React 18 APIs. Nothing fancy going on here. I have a little use query hook. It's probably similar to data fetching hooks you all have used. It gives us the data right here. If we don't have it, we render an initial spinner on load. And then we show the details. We have a little form right here. And then we have a submit handler right here. So handle add to cart, just a little event handler. It's going to prevent default. It sets some pending state to true. That's what renders this spinner. And it makes an API request here to add to cart. So these are just hitting API routes. Same with this one right here. And once that comes back, if the JSON is OK, we go ahead and call revalidate. That's bound to our query. So that's why this cart updates when we click this. And if it's not, if there was an error, we set some React state called error, and that's what shows this. Once we're down to 0, we hit add to cart, and we see our little error. So pretty standard stuff. We've probably all written a lot of React code that looks like this, and I want to talk about some of the things in React 19 that address some of the issues with this code. So there are some issues with this code. What do you think I should do to highlight, to reveal those issues? Any ideas? What should I do to break my app? How would you break my app? Let's just try pressing the button a couple of times. That's usually how you break most React apps, right? OK, that's pretty strange. Let's look at that again. I'm going to go ahead and refresh. I'm going to add two items to the stock right here. And let's press it twice. 1, 2. OK, so it goes from 6. And then the pending indicator goes away, and then it shows 7. So we have a little bit of a race condition in our event handler. Once the first submission goes through, this line gets called, and it flips the pending indicator false. But there's another one going out, and it calls revalidate, which causes that update. So if we go up to 2 here, and I press this 3 times, 1, 2, 3, we're going to see a similar kind of race condition-like behavior here. So historically, this kind of async behavior, these async submissions, event handlers, React hasn't really had anything as part of its first-class APIs to help us sort these sort of race conditions out. And this is exactly where actions come in. So the first API we want to look at here is start transition. And you may have heard of start transition because it's been in React for a while. We can take this handle add to cart, and let's bring in start transition from React. So I'm going to wrap this whole thing in start transition. Now, we have a problem here, and that's we have these awaits. This is an async event handler. And again, if you've used start transition because it's been in React for about a year, you may not know what to do here, but React 19 is introducing async support for transition. So we can actually pass in an async function to start transition, and this creates an action. This is what an action is. And so if I save this, let's come back, add to the stock here, and see how the behavior changed. I'm going to click this once, and let's just see what happens. OK, so we get from 9 to 10. We lost the pending indicator, but it seemed to work. Let's add 2 and click this 1, 2, 3 times. So we don't see any pending indicators, but we also dropped the stale updates to the UI. So our UI didn't update for any of those kind of stale updates. The app waited for all of the async transitions to settle before making an update. So right away, it's a huge win. We didn't have to really change anything about this logic here. This kind of goes back to what Josh and Joe were talking about in the keynote about how this is really a coordinating local updates with asynchronous functions. This is a great way to do it, and we really didn't have to change much at all. But how do we get that pending indicator back? Because that would be nice to have right here, and we don't have it anymore. Well, if we click Add to Cart, we're not seeing it. And it's kind of weird, right? We're calling setIsPending right here in our function, and we still are rendering from this state. So why aren't we seeing this in our UI? Well, anything that is inside of start transition is a low priority update. You might hear it called low priority or non-urgent. And the whole idea with transitions is it's kind of like a bomb shelter where React can kind of make all these updates in the background without blocking the current UI, still keeping it responsive, and wait until all of those actions settle before it applies updates to the UI. So that's great for things like this revalidate function or our error, right? Because those come in all at once. But this pending state, that's not very useful to us. When we click on this, setIsPending to true is being called in the background, but we want it to actually apply to our current UI. So what we can do is bring in another new hook called useTransition. And this hook is going to give us 2 return values, a Boolean and a start transition function. So we get the isPending right here, and we also get start transition like this. So now we don't need to import start transition from React anymore. And we don't need our own isPending state. So we can delete this whole thing right here. And we can also delete this, and we can delete this. So now if we refresh, add 1 to the stock, let's click it once. We got our pending flag back, pretty cool. Let's go ahead and add 2 and click this 1, 2, 3 times. And now we don't have any of those race conditions at all. We get a single update, again, once all actions settle. Very cool stuff. So these actions are solving a lot of these kinds of problems for us. I kind of think of it like useEffect lets us put a lot of this imperative logic inside of these declarative boundaries. And transitions are kind of letting us do the same thing for asynchronous functions. So let's talk about this start transition function right here. This is pretty cool. We like the behavior that we're seeing. Does this mean we have to wrap all of our event handlers everywhere and start transition all over our app? Well, this is where the action function comes in on the form element. And Andrew talked about this as well. So instead of just using an event handler, handle add to cart, maybe handle submit is the generic version of this, we're going to change this to the action prop. And actions don't get the event like this, so we don't need this. And we don't need to call prevent default right there. So that's kind of the first benefit. Actions on a form already know we're submitting a form. They're going to prevent the default for us. They're going to do some other cool stuff like progressive enhancement, like Andrew talked about. But that's kind of one little cleanup right there. And then secondly, we want to go ahead and rename this from handle add to cart to add to cart action. And this is just a convention. It doesn't actually have any behavior, but this is a nice convention for passing functions to the action prop. And in the future, UI libraries, things like Radix, might expose action props on their calendar components. And so things like that would be good to, this is the kind of convention that the React team has set for us here. So we have an action. We're still calling start transition. Let's refresh this. Let's add 1 to the stock and click add to cart. Looks like everything's still good. Nothing's really changed. 1, 2, 3, everything's still working. But let's go ahead and delete start transition. So now I'm going to delete start transition. And now we're just back to a good old async function. Let's refresh this. And now if I click add to cart, well, it works. We've lost our pending state because we're no longer using our own start transition. But if we go ahead and add to the stock right here and click this 1, 2, 3 times, we are going to see the same batching behavior. We get a single update once all actions settle. So this is kind of the way we use actions on the form element, and so we don't have to call start transition everywhere in our app. But now that we're not using this use transition hook, which can be nice if you're not using a form or you just want access to the pending state, how do we get that pending state back? Well, there's actually a couple ways. If I delete that and we go ahead and organize our imports, get rid of things that we're not using here. The first way, if you remember, Lydia mentioned the use form status hook. And that gives us the status of any pending actions that are being submitted on a parent form. And you can think of it, the form is kind of like the context provider. So we need to make something as a child here in order to use that. So pending. Let's just make, let's just make this called pending. And this is like, it's kind of useful for design systems. It makes it easy to share these around different forms. We'll talk about a second way to use it, which I think is going to be more common, but I just want to show this. So pending, let's say, takes in children, which is a React node. And it's going to use form status. Right? So status returns an object, and we can destructure this and see what's inside. We're going to see has all this cool stuff about the last submission, including its pending. So if we're pending, then let's go ahead and return children. And now when we click this, we'll render our children if the form is pending, and it goes away if not. So we can just stick our spinner right back in here, just like that. And now you could drop this in any form that has an action. Again, it's really nice that React now speaks the language of async transitions. It's really like, I think of actions kind of like first-class promises that React understands. And so any form that takes an action that's coming from anywhere will trigger this pending component. So this is a nice little pattern you can see for getting our pending indicator back. So if we add 2 again, we're going to see the same behavior, 1, 2, 3. The pending indicator stays there the whole time. The UI only updates once all the actions are settled. But let's look at the second way, which is not going to be this pending component. It's actually going to be use action state. So use action state is another new hook, and ignore the import right here. This is just a local one because these are React Canary-driven conference demos. But it all works exactly the same. It's just a little local version. And how does use action state work? Well, just like use state, use action state gives us some state, and it gives us an updater function, right? Use state gives us a state and an updater. Use action state gives us a state and an updater. The updater, in this case, is the action, right? It's the actual action that we're going to pass to our form, but it's the function that updates the state. So that's how to think about the signature of these hooks. And the third thing it gives us is pending. So how do we actually use action state? Well, we just pass in an async function, and we just move all this stuff right up here. And let's go ahead and call this action add to cart action. We're just going to rename this. Just like use state, we can name this whatever we want. So we're still passing it in right here. All we've done is use the return value of use action state. And now if we use is pending to show our spinner, we should get back to where we had at the beginning. So is pending. Let's add some to our stock. 1, 2, 3. Pretty cool. Back in business. So I think use action state, and there's the update. I think use action state is going to probably be a pretty common way that you will get a hold of the action within, like your main routes and your main page components. Use the is pending state for some feedback in the current UI. But what about this state right here? We haven't used this argument yet. What is the state value from this hook? Well, this is actually whatever our action returns. It's the return value from the last submission of this action. So if you hover this over right now, you see it's void because we don't return anything. It kind of is easiest to see if you just return something here and you look. This is going to be a string. And on the first render, if we just log this and I just pop open this console right here, the first render is actually undefined because what is the last return value of your action submission when you first load the page? Well, it hasn't been submitted yet, so it's undefined. And that's actually what this second argument is for right here to use action state. So you could say ABC right here, right, DEF. So when you first load this, you get that initial value. But for our case, undefined is just fine. And then once we actually submit this, we see undefined. Once we submit this, we see that return value. So what would we want to use this return value for? Well, this return value is useful for anything you want to use from your action that you want to use in the current UI. And what are we doing with this error right here? Exactly that, right? We're seeing if we have an error from our action, let's go ahead and set that state in React and show it right here, that it's out of stock. So this seems like a perfect use case for state. So instead of setting the error right here and right here, let's just return this. And that way, this state variable is just going to be an error. And if it's null, it means our action didn't return anything or it wasn't run yet, and so we don't have an error. But if it does exist, it means we're in this branch of our action, and so we want to show that error. So let's get rid of this state right here. Get rid of that. And down here, we're still rendering error and this little p tag in red in case we don't have a stock, in case we have an error. So let's try it out. There we go. Let's add one. And it clears. So pretty cool. Everything's working just as before, but we don't even have use state anymore, kind of like Ryan was saying, you know. State is still very important to React. It's still the state setting that is making this all work, that is allowing React to kind of update our app in the background. React State is powering all of this, but from our perspective, we don't really have to use a lot of this stuff. And I think this is pretty cool. If we actually just come here and take a look at the diff and what we have, let's see. Maybe I can just close that for a second so we can get this full screen. This is what we started with over here on the left. We had our own state managing for the error and the pending state. We had an async function handler for handling the submit event where we had to prevent the default. We flipped the pending to true. We waited some stuff. We flipped it back to false. We saw that gave us some raise conditions. And over here, we just bring in use action state. Our business logic right here is very similar. It's kind of the same. You can kind of squint and see that's really the important stuff. That's the meat of what our application's doing. But we've delegated the error handling, the pending, and the action behavior, again, with some added benefits like progressive enhancement, the hydration stuff that Andrew was talking about, just by switching this from on submit to action. And not only is this the refactor, and the code, I think, reads a lot better, it's actually, it performs better. It doesn't have those race conditions that we saw in the beginning. So that's pretty awesome. And again, just like Andrew said, actions were first introduced kind of in the React ecosystem through server actions and server component frameworks like Next, but everything we just saw is all client actions. So we're all in client land. That means all of these features are useful for any React app out there. They work for any React app. So that's pretty awesome. Cool. So this is kind of like a nice recreation of our initial UI using use action state. And we have a little kind of pessimistic UI right here, right? We don't show any updates. We show the user something's happening, and then we re-render once everything's happened. What if we wanted to show an optimistic update? Well, there's another hook called use optimistic. And this is a really cool hook. I really like this one. So what is use optimistic? It's kind of like use state again, so it kind of gives us the same two things, except it's going to be derived from some server props, some other props, but usually from some server props. So let's pass in the initial value of data, and this is going to give us optimistic data and set optimistic data. So just like useState. And let's start by grabbing optimistic data. And right here where we're rendering the items, let's save this. And we're going to see that everything is basically the same. So that's pretty cool. Nothing really changed. Well, what's the point? Well, the point is if we come here to our form and we go ahead and invoke this, we can use this set optimistic function to update the data that it represents in the client while any actions are pending. So let's just actually call set optimistic data. And what are we going to do here? Well, data is this object that we get back from our cart, has a bunch of properties. Let's just copy those properties over. And what do we want to do when we actually click this if we wanted to make an optimistic UI? Right? When we click this, if we're assuming that the submission is going to go through, we think the cart's going to go up by 1, right? And right here, we're rendering optimistic data.items. So let's just say that the new optimistic items is d.items plus 1. So let's refresh this. And when I click, look at that, 34. Let's add some more. 35, 36, 37. So this is basically giving us a portal into the current UI. It's letting us make changes. But once all the actions settle, anything we've done, any calls we've made to set optimistic data get thrown away. They get discarded. And we revert back to the original server data that's passed in right here. And this is really cool because check this out. If I go back to toStock and I click this 1, 2, 3 times, we're going to see optimistically we're showing 40, but once all of those finish, we go back down to 39. And this is another point that Andrew made, which is the traditional form action model, where you kind of just submit a form and then you refresh from the server. There's something that's forgiving about it. It's very forgiving because if you make a mistake, you're just going to regenerate your UI at the end of the day. And so you don't have to worry about things that you manage on the client disagreeing with the server-side data. And this is basically the design of optimistic. Once all the actions settle, all of these optimistic updates are discarded. They're completely thrown away. And so that means that your app is guaranteed to render exactly the same whether or not you're using optimistic. It's a really neat property of use optimistic that once your app is in a settled state, it renders exactly the same as if you didn't use it. And it's actually, that property is also true of suspense. When you have suspense boundaries, they render their fallbacks when your app is in a pending or loading state. But once your app is settled, an app with suspense and an app where you just comment out all those suspense boundaries will look exactly the same. So it's a nice forgiving model, and I think it's a really cool hook. So those are the client hooks. Again, we haven't even talked about server actions or server components, but the cool thing is that all of these work with server actions and server components. So I'm here next, and I have a client component. If I just made this, let's just make this a server component. Let's see how what this change would look like. I'm just going to comment out all of this client stuff. And this is the last little demo here. And here we see kind of the skeleton of the UI. Now I'm in a server component, so I want to make a query directly. I don't want to make an API query. Let's look at this API cart route. And we see it's just doing this. So let's just kind of inline this right here. This cart has an ID and it has an items or it's null. So if there's no cart, let's just not found this just so we can make sure we have a cart down here. And let's bring back our cart's items. So there we go, refreshing the app. We don't have a loading state anymore because we always have the data since the server components block on fetching the data. Pretty cool. And how do we get, so we don't need this. What about this action right here? Add to cart action. Let's bring this back to kind of how we had it before. We have an add to cart action. We can't use action state, so we don't need that. Let's undo this. And let's just go back to function. This is an async function. add to cart action. But we are in a server component now, so we can't pass functions directly to client components unless we make them a server action. So let's actually just mark this with useServer. And again, we don't want to make a fetch call. Let's just pop open add to cart, the route right here. And it looks like it's just calling this add to cart function, so we'll just replace this like that. We'll go ahead and import this. And that's going to be the JSON response. So if we're OK, well, we don't know what to do to revalidate yet. But let's see if this works. I'm going to add something to my stock, press this. We're not seeing an update. That makes sense because we didn't revalidate. But if I refresh, we do see it worked. How do we revalidate it next? Here we call something called revalidate path. This is one way to do it. So let's just add that right there. Go ahead and organize our imports, clean that up, refresh. Now when I click add to cart, eventually we see an update. But we don't have any of the feedback, the pending state. Let's see, or the error. Let's see if we have no stock left. Whoops. If we have no stock and I hit add to cart, nothing happens. We don't see any feedback, but of course there was an error. And so at this point, you could make a client component and basically do everything we just did. But you can also get a little creative with your client components, the interfaces they expose. And I'm just going to import a form component right here from components/form. And let's see. Oh, as form. From, thank you. It's lunchtime. So I'm going to switch form with form.root. Okay. And I have a form.pending that we can use to render the spinner. Let's import this again, because I just commented that out. And now we get our pending indicator back. And what if we go down and we have an error? We don't see that, but I also have a form. Before we were rendering this with state. We don't have state because we're in a server component, but I can just actually, change this to form.error. And I'm not going to render the error in here. I'm just doing that kind of inside of this component. But there's the error. And so now I can refresh. I can add 2 to the stock, press this 1, 2, 3 times. We're going to see exactly the same behavior as before. We only get a single update. We get the error, we get the pending state, but now we're in kind of server component land. And this is a server component with a server action. It's powering this entire UI. Pretty cool stuff, I think. I love seeing that React now speaks this language of actions. It works on client React. It works in server React. Actually, this form action doesn't even know whether you're passing it in a client action or a server action. I think that's pretty awesome. And basically, just like suspense, decoupled the loading state from our code and decoupled it and basically delegated it to React so that we could write more composable loading states. Error boundaries did the same thing for error handling. It decoupled the error handling from our code so that it could compose in the React tree. Actions do exactly the same thing for our pending states. And if we look in this form code, components form, we're just going to see all the stuff that we just saw. We're just using action state here. So again, this coordination problem, we just ask React for the action state. It's going to tell us here whether it's pending or not. Here's the last state. Actions let us decouple and compose our code while being able to delegate the is pending state up to React, just like suspense and error boundaries did for loading and error states. So I'm pretty excited to see how actions kind of percolate through the ecosystem. I think they're going to unlock a lot of unexpected ways that different libraries will work together. You know, when hooks first came out, I mean, useEffects and useState, I mean, they were cool. They're fun to write, but these days, we really don't write a lot of useEffects ourselves because it's all tucked inside a library code. And it really opened up quite unexpected ways for different libraries to work together. You know, when useEffect came out, I didn't know I'd be able to use Spring from Framer Motion to animate a dialogue from Radix that was created with a portal. And I think in the same way, these actions, now that that React speaks this language is going to open up a ton of cool stuff and a ton of novel ways that libraries and components will be able to work together in very unexpected ways. So I'm pretty excited for that, and that's my talk. Thank you so much.